What is the Council of Nicea, and what is its relevance for Christians today? And we are back with Pastor Tom Pietsch to do another commemoration on the church's calendar. But this time not to talk about a particular figure in church history or the Bible, but to talk about the Council of Nicea. So before we get to the details of the Council of Nicea, what on earth are we talking about when we say a council of the church?
Right, it's strange for it to be on the calendar because it's not a person, it's not one saint. It's a place where a bunch of saints gathered. And a council of the church, the Council of Nicea is the first council, or maybe the second. I'll get back to that in a second. It's a place where bishops usually meet together, teachers, and usually nut out some aspect of church doctrine that is under contention. The Council of Nicea is really the most prominent one. When I say it may be the second one, the first one really is in the book of Acts, the Council of Jerusalem, where the apostles themselves come together and other bishops, James, the brother of Jesus, to work out elements of early Christian doctrine. So when the Council of Nicea is held almost 300 years later, in the year 325, it sort of has a precedent in the book of Acts.
And I think one of the reasons that it's hard for modern people to get their heads around this is that the church, in all of its division today, east and west, and endless denominations spread out across the globe, it seems like that's sort of inevitable to us in a sense, and to actually to get our minds back to a time in the early church where there still was this sense of one church, which we believe in theologically, but in our experience, it seems miles away from that.
So you could say a council is like our synod in the Lutheran Church, and yet it's not quite the same, because here, you're right, this is sort of all of Christendom is invited. The Emperor Constantine is the one who hosts the council. I think he sends out something like 1,800 invitations to 1,800 bishops who represent all corners of the globe in Christendom. Not that many attend. The number is often given as 318. It's sort of a bit of a mythical number in some ways, because it's more likely that 300 or maybe as low as 200 attended. But it was still a huge gathering and of momentous importance.
Because each of those representing groups of people, each of those 200 or 300.
They are, that's right, representing groups of people. But even more so, Constantine had just really won power. He defeated Licinius, and he becomes the sole emperor over the Roman Empire, and he's Christian. First time this has happened. And it's huge because Christians have been persecuted before then, persecuted quite a bit. And so he calls this council, and there's this dramatic scene, we have records of it, of these bishops who had all lived under persecution, hobbling in to convene this council. I'm going to read you just a little bit if I can. This was written about 100 years later, or a bit less. Chairs were there made for all, and the king entered and sat with them. He kissed the spots which were the marks of Christ in their bodies. This is places that they've been persecuted. People had eyes chipped out, or limbs chopped off, or tongues off even. Of the 318 fathers, only 11 were free from such marks. But all the others were more or less maimed in their persecutions from heretics. Some had their eyes taken out, some had their ears cut off, some had their teeth dug out by the roots. Some had the nails of their fingers and toes torn out, some were otherwise mutilated. In a word, there was no one without marks of violence, save the above-named persons. It's this kind of, almost like a convening of the church after this insane period of persecution, retribution. There's even stories of Constantine kissing the wounds of these revered bishops. They weren't bishops just because they taught well, but because they suffered well and they stood up for Christ in persecution. So it's this momentous day in the history of the church, and it's today was the day that it was convened, the 12th of June.
And so the details of the council itself, this is obviously a huge topic. Books are written on this subject. So perhaps one way to get to the nitty-gritty of it is to ask a question like, if we didn't have the Council of Nicea, What would have been different in Christian history? What could have been different for us today?
So the Nicene Creed is what we remember from the Council of Nicea. It's the creed that the council gives is not quite the creed we confess at church. That was worked out 60 years later, but the basis is there. The basis is there. And the main confession there is that Jesus is of one nature, of one being, of one substance with the Father. This was the contentious issue at the time. There was a priest, Arius, who was arguing. His famous line was, there was a time when he was not. There was a time when Jesus was not. He was saying that God is the Father. Jesus is this special divine being who sure has existed for a long time, maybe even before the creation of the world. But nevertheless, he's still a creation of God the Father. And this was causing uproar in the churches. There were people responding and saying, well, if Jesus wasn't God, then he couldn't save us. He couldn't help us. And so this is sort of the main goal of the Council of Nicea, is the proclamation that Jesus is God. What that does partly also is work out this clear distinction between the Creator and the creation. So there's a clear distinction between God who creates and the creation who receives his creation. Arius was sometimes talking about Jesus as a kind of an intermediary being. And the Council of Nicea said, you can't hedge your bets here. Either Jesus is the creator or he's a creature. And if he's a creature, he can't save us. So even in the creed, we have the line, for us and for our salvation. So at the heart of this is also a salvific concern, that Jesus has no power to save if Jesus is not God. So in many ways, it's a counsel for us Lutherans to love, because it proclaimed this salvation that Christ has won only because he came as God in the flesh.
I remember working with a group of chaplains on to do with Christian chaplaincy in schools and various areas, and these were a group of Christians that weren't really all that, who didn't use the Nicene Creed all that often, right? So we're used to confessing it, and they obviously knew it, but it wasn't part of their custom so much. But then we had some applications from chaplains from different groups that weren't really part of the mainstream Christian churches and had some strange views about who Jesus was.
Yeah.
But they thought they could fit under this banner of Christian chaplaincy, and these chaplains said, well, what do we do here? What do we go back to? And lo and behold, where it ended up after a long discussion was, well, can we go to the Nicene Creed, actually, because this is actually what binds us together in many ways, particularly when it comes to who Jesus is and the message of the gospel that we want to communicate into this space as chaplains. And so I sat there with a bit of a grin on my face as all these folk got back around to the Nicene Creed.
Look, one of the most ecumenical things you can do is confess the Nicene Creed on a Sunday morning. It's a high point in some ways of the liturgy. A high point, I mean, there are so many high points in the liturgy, you can't play them off against each other, but it's the creed that the East confesses. All the Orthodox churches, the Roman Catholic Church, Protestant churches should confess this, even though they sometimes don't. We also have the Apostles' Creed at baptism. The East don't know about it. Also, even, funnily enough, the Athanasian Creed, which seems to be, the East will love this, they don't know about it either. They have the Nicene Creed, we have the Nicene Creed. It's the unifying creed for Christendom, because at the heart is this confession that Jesus is Lord, the shortest confession of faith really that the New Testament gives. Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord. And the Nicene Creed is really just a way of safeguarding this and proclaiming it with joy as well, not just defensively, but positively as well.
Now, the Council of Nicea also comes up in more sort of popular work as well, sometimes with all sorts of strange things. I wonder if it's worth commenting on this, that the authors like Dan Brown and other people like this will come in with comments about the Council of Nicea was when Constantine wrestled control of the Christian church and transformed it into something it had never been before, decided which books were going to be in the Bible and all this sort of thing. So what do you make of these sorts of claims about the Council of Nicea just being a big political play by Constantine to make the church his own sort of thing?
Politics was involved. Okay, so certainly Constantine comes to power, he's a Christian, and suddenly he sees this church and they're arguing with each other, and the politician in him thinks, this is crazy. We want to try and provide a united front. We've got to get together and tidy this up. But to think this is a top-down movement, the theology was, and the debates were pre-Constantine and post-Constantine as well. And more recent scholarship has shown how much too, even in terms of growth, the church was building and building and building beneath the persecution of the church. And so it got to sort of a critical mass. So Constantine really rides the wave of the momentum of the church rather than creates the momentum for the church. So I don't want to deny political elements. They're always there in councils and synods, and yet anyone who reads the historical record will see that there's far greater things going on here, including this great confession that Jesus is Lord. A confession that isn't new. Okay, the creeds are always looking back to the scriptures, but so there's nothing. It's in continuity with centuries of Christian history before the Council of Nicea. So Constantine doesn't pluck this doctrine out of the sky or make something that's foreign to the church's history, and yet it does codify and clarify an impulse, a spiritual impulse, the Holy Spirit's direction of the church that pre-existed Constantine and exists beyond him as well.
One of the other possibly apocryphal stories that I'm fond of about the Council of Nicea is that maybe the bishops got into punch-ups there.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
So you're going to be a wet blanket and tell me there's no truth in that?
I'm sorry, I am. Well, so there's a story that St. Nicholas, Father Christmas himself, punched Arius in the face. Look, let's just say it's a great story, and look, it was recorded much later, and so no one's going to tell you it definitely happened, but there's a great meme about it that you should put up as well. That's fantastic. I'm going to tell you one more thing, one more interesting thing that the Council gives. It gives us the Nicene Creed, this kind of doctrinal decrees, and then it gives what's called the canons, which are these interesting, very practical adjudications, really, on sort of practical matters in the church. We get the word canon law, which sort of develops from it, and it even sets a template for church council decrees, like even the Augsburg Confession, which begins with the Articles of Doctrine and then has articles on practice. And the practice ones are very interesting. I bet you can't guess the first canon.
No, you have to tell us.
What's the most important sort of issue that they're dealing with? What's number one on the list when they get to the canons? It's concerning those who have made themselves eunuchs and whether they can become priests.
Right.
So this was a pressing issue for them at the time. But they go on to talk about whether you can become a clergyman after you've if you've converted recently, about appointments of bishops, about excommunication. In fact, they even recommend sort of pastors' conferences get together to share notes on who's been excommunicated. It's almost the beginning of the kind of pastors and dioceses meeting together, because else you'd be excommunicated in one parish and then you turn up with fake glasses at another parish.
Across town,
you get in. So all sorts of interesting practical matters that the canons deal with too, that are a great legacy for us as well. One more doctrinal thing, which is just very important also. There are many dimensions that we're not going into. Arius's problem was that if God is truly God, he can't get involved with the world. This will compromise his divinity. Arius's concern was a positive one. He didn't want to be a heretic. He didn't wake up and think, how do I stuff up the church? He thought, in order for God to be God, he has to be discreet, separate from all the muck that's in the world. And so the Son cannot be God, because that would be to compromise God. And so the vision that Arius has of God is actually somewhat static. A God, almost a mathematician's God, a God who sits in the heavens removed from us. The Nicene Creed brings God low, confesses that the man on the tree was God, is God. And so without the Nicene Creed, the whole picture of Christian faith looks different. It looks of a safe God, a protected God, not a God who entered into our world, who took on our natures, our flesh, who died our death, and so destroyed it as he rose again and leads us into everlasting life too.
Well, thanks again, Tom, for leading us into the Council of Nicea and its ongoing relevance for Christians today. This is Kairos. It's great to have you here. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you've enjoyed it. Tom, thanks again.
My pleasure.